Hey guys, tonight we won't be talking about the glittering romance of royal dynasties. Tonight, we're going to strip away the false gilded layers, to look straight at the place where absolute glory meets terrifying rot. For centuries, we've heard the tales of the Sun King, Louis XIV, the man who turned his sheer will into the splendid marble of Versailles, a monarch whose every gesture was a ritual, who placed himself at the center of the universe. But there is one story history often omits, a foul secret hidden beneath the silk brocade and costly perfume, his death. It was not the serene passing of a god, but a horrific descent into agony and disgust, where absolute power was forced to kneel before a mere germ. We're going to explore how his once powerful body began to betray him, how a small ulcer turned into a blackened, putrid crater, and why courtiers had to vomit upon witnessing the king's death that dragged on for nearly 1 month. This is the naked truth. Bacteria do not bow to kings. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And before we begin this long journey, let me know where you're watching from and what your local time is, so I know how many people are closing their eyes with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Oh, in the hushed splendor of Versailles, where every surface gleamed with gilded mirrors reflecting the unchallenged authority of absolute monarchy, a far more unsettling aroma began to permeate the marbled corridors. By the year 1715, the sweet scent of roses and the lingering incense of chapel prayers had given way to something grotesque, the putrid stench of decay. It was the corpse of Louis XIV, the most magnificent monarch in European history, lying motionless in agony. There were no solemn funeral rites, no tearful lamentations from grieving subjects, only a nightmarish procession of blackened flesh and oozing sores that no measure of royal privilege could halt. To grasp the full weight of this tragedy, one must first understand how Louis XIV meticulously crafted his persona over 7 decades. Born on September 5th, 1638, he ascended to the throne at the tender age of 5, anointed with holy oil, and proclaimed God's earthly representative. This was no medieval fairy tale of divine right. It was a calculated political performance. Every gesture was choreographed, every syllable measured for its impact. Guests from foreign courts spoke in awed whispers of his godlike presence, how a single step could shift the very atmosphere of the Hall of Mirrors. As he matured, Louis discerned a fundamental truth about power. Perception is reality, and reality can be manufactured. He did not merely rule France, he became France. Each morning's awakening, known as the lever, was transformed into a sacred ritual. Dozens of nobles vied for the honor of witnessing his first movements, of kneeling to assist him into his silk stockings, of serving as living proof of his supremacy. In those moments, they were not courtiers, but actors in his grand drama. Versailles itself was the ultimate stage for this spectacle. Built upon reclaimed marshland through sheer force of will and wealth, it functioned as both a temple to his authority and a gilded prison for the aristocracy. By requiring noble families to reside within its walls, he forced them to pour fortunes into lavish costumes and elaborate ceremonies, turning potential rivals into decorative pets, all eager to curry favor. When Louis donned high heels, every gentleman at court waddled awkwardly behind him. When he powdered his hair white, 1,000 wigs bloomed across the marble floors. When he decreed that only certain colors were permissible on specific days, Lyons' silk merchants toiled endlessly to satisfy demand. This was no mere vanity, it was power wielded through image and ritual. The irony is stark. The very elements that ensured Louis's omnipresence in the minds of his subjects would later underscore the horror of his downfall. For, by year 1715, the same hallways that once echoed with the clatter of ornate carriage wheels were now heavy with the scent of gangrene. The king who had forged an empire of spectacle now found himself imprisoned in a body ravaged by infection. His once stately legs, wrapped in silken hose and elevated by decorative heels, had become swollen, discolored limbs oozing with pus. No silver basin could contain the flow, no royal decree could banish the bacteria. Yet even as his flesh betrayed him, Louis tenaciously clung to his rituals. He insisted on maintaining the lever despite tremors that coursed through his weakened frame. Courtiers, clutching perfumed handkerchiefs, positioned themselves upwind, careful not to appear ungracious. State dinners continued at precisely 8 o'clock, with the king propped upright on cushions and fed spoonful by pallid servants struggling to conceal their nausea. All the while, the stench wafted beneath the banquet tables, mingling with the sweet notes of imported wines and the rustle of satins. Thus the stage was set for a final, grotesque act, the collapse of the greatest theatrical production of Louis's life. From the moment he was crowned as a child prince to his ultimate descent into a spectacle of decay, his story serves as a chilling reminder that even the most artfully constructed illusions cannot stave off the fundamental equality of death. In Versailles' golden halls, the end of the Sun King's reign was less a coronation of legacy than a requiem for human frailty, proof that no amount of privilege can shield any man from his mortality. And so, as candles guttered in their sconces and whispers of dread replaced the courtly fanfares, the curtains fell not on triumph, but on a horror that reverberated far beyond the palace gates. The inescapable truth that beneath every crown lies but a mortal skull. At the very heart of Versailles, the supreme monument to monarchical power in Europe, Louis XIV fashioned not merely a royal residence but a sprawling ecosystem of political theatre. Rising from marshland through the force of his will and the inexhaustible resources of the French crown, the palace served dual purposes. It was at once a dazzling symbol of absolute authority and a gilded prison that bound the nobility ever closer to the person of the king. Rather than governing France solely by edict and decree, Louis turned court life itself into psychological warfare, compelling his aristocrats to inhabit a stage of his own design. To secure their presence at Versailles, he required that nobles maintain households there at their own expense, transforming them into permanent contestants in the race for royal favour. Each sumptuous costume, each ornate wig, each jewelled accessory served a single aim: to amplify his supremacy. If the king appeared in red velvet trimmed with ermine, the courtiers hastened to match his palette. If he donned sapphire, hued satin, lions' silkworm farms laboured through interminable nights to supply enough bolts of cloth. Entire fortunes were spent by families who yearned for but a fleeting glance from the monarch, their survival tied to a momentary flicker of royal attention. Louis extended this paradigm of control even to his own body, converting the most private spaces of sovereignty into instruments of power. He maintained the ritual of ruling from his bedchamber, a practice that forced ministers to approach his repose as supplicants. Each morning's lever, the ceremony marking his waking, was the apex of courtly deference, an intimate audience in which lords and ladies quietly slipped past attendants, knelt beside his horizontal throne, and listened for the soft intonations of his voice. Far from an idle custom, the lever underscored the rigid hierarchy that made even the greatest noble feel small in the presence of divine rule. Yet the architect of this grand spectacle would be the first to endure its tragic collapse. Beneath layers of silk, and beneath the weight of a crown that had once conferred godlike status, Louis began to taste the first sour notes of physical decline. By the late 1680s, when he was in his 50s, the earliest fissures in his imperious facade became apparent. Chronic gastric pain left him pale and perspiring even amidst grand processions. Hemorrhoids rendered standing for extended ceremonies unbearable, though he never admitted to any sign of frailty. His once pristine teeth decayed into blackened stumps, sending ambassadors from Spain and Venice to inhale through their mouths during audiences, fearful that polite neutrality might betray their disgust. In response, Louis refused to abandon his rituals. He continued to make daily appearances in his custom-tailored garments, each cuff and collar as precise as the day he first wore them. Even when his gait wavered, his posture sagged, and sweat beaded on his brow, he allowed no observer to glimpse his vulnerability. The lever persisted, now a poignant counterpoint. The image of a sovereign struggling to rise, yet compelled by pride and protocol to maintain the dignity of that rising. Behind the velvet curtains and behind the golden crown, his power began to crack, hinting at the catastrophic unraveling that his body would soon undergo. In this way, the political ecosystem at Versailles both nurtured and concealed the king's mortality. The courtiers, conditioned to read every hue of his wardrobe and every inflection of his voice, learned to interpret the slightest tremor in his hand or the briefest hesitation in his speech. Yet, by design, they could not halt the performance. They remained actors on a stage too vast to escape. As every silken thread and every perfumed handkerchief served to reinforce the myth of the Sun King's invincibility, these same trappings would later magnify the horror of his decline. Thus, in the final decade of Louis's enduring reign, the very machinery of spectacle that had once projected his omnipotence began to foreshadow its dissolution. The palace's mirrored galleries, which once reflected his glory back upon itself, would soon echo with whispers of illness and fear. As Versailles stood resplendent under the French sun, its golden tapestries hid the brewing storm within the flesh of the monarch. In that hidden sickness lay the prelude to a tragedy that would strip away every illusion and reveal the stark, inescapable truth of human frailty, that even the most artful performance cannot stave off the final curtain of mortality. When the first sores appeared on the king's leg, Louis XIV would not admit to any weakness. In the year 1688, small ulcers barely larger than a silver coin began to mar his once unblemished skin. Yet rather than seek rest or respite, he transformed each pang of pain into a new scene in his grand courtly drama. The royal physicians employed every prevailing treatment of the era. Flesh was incised with a heated blade, cloths steeped in brandy were pressed to the wound, and coarse salt and ash were rubbed into the torn flesh. Each application delivered a searing agony that Louis greeted with guttural cries, the acrid smoke of burning skin filling the air. Maidservants, trained in the unspoken rite of service, would hurry from the chamber, their pale faces turned away as the smell of charred tissue clung to brocade tapestries. Meanwhile, the king's lavish diet only intensified his suffering. Daily feasts commenced with multiple broths. Potages simmered for hours, followed by generous portions of venison, boar, and pâté, crafted from the finest French truffles. Courses of spiced poultry and glazed ham were washed down with goblets of fortified wine, brandy-soaked fruits, and sweetmeats glazed in honey. Yet, his increasingly sedentary routine, riding only briefly each day, and spending countless hours reclining in silk-lined chambers, left his digestion in perpetual turmoil. The rich sauces and dense meats sat heavy on his stomach, each meal a fresh reminder of the cruel irony that the very abundance designed to honor his status also tormented his body from within. As the ulcers spread outward, the nobility devised subtle rituals to withstand the growing stench. Courtiers perfected a skillless art of inhaling only through mouths, tilting their heads just so to let the foul air drift beneath their nostrils. Perfumed handkerchiefs became indispensable tokens of privilege, embroidered with the royal cipher and carried like talismans. Even when Louis insisted on parading through the gardens, his form propped upon cushions in a gilded sedan chair, his attendants would scatter fresh flowers at his feet and burn incense in brazier rings to mask the reek. Yet each floral offering and plume of smoke only highlighted the grotesque contrast between Versailles' splendor and the rot that festered at its center. No amount of ceremony could halt the relentless advance of disease. The ulcers deepened into caverns of putrefaction, the flesh darkening from crimson to violet, then to a mottled black that exuded a cloying, sour odor. Bones seemed visible through the thin veil of skin, as though the infection had burrowed past every barrier. Sleep grew nearly impossible. The king would toss and turn in his bedchambers, each movement causing fresh bursts of pain. Only the most potent soporifics mixtures of opium and laudanum prescribed by the royal apothecaries could edge him toward a fitful half-slumber, where nightmares of battlefields and plague-ridden villages chased him through fevered visions. Upon waking, his eyes flickered with a haunted desperation, as though he sought refuge from the bodily betrayal that no privilege could reverse. In those final years, Versailles' gilded halls echoed a sobering truth. No display of wealth, no ceremony of state, no layering of silk and perfume could suspend the immutable cycle of life. Louis XIV, sovereign of France for 77 years, had wielded authority with the precision of a master playwright, yet even his carefully staged performances could not obscure the fundamental reality that every human frame must yield to aging and decay. As courtiers bowed their heads and whispered prayers, the Sun King's legacy began to fade, not in triumphant twilight, but beneath the slow, inexorable shadow of suffering. By the year 1705, the decay in Louis XIV's leg had advanced from a mere ulcer to what courtiers grimly referred to as the abyss. The wound spanned nearly 15 centimeters, about the width of the king's leather boot, its edges seared black, with gangrene. Each day, The foul stench of rotting flesh spread through the marbled halls of Versailles, seeping into the very stone and mingling with the lingering scent of candle wax. The bandages, soaked through with dark, viscous fluid, left damp footprints on the polished marble, mapping a trail of slow death that none dared fully acknowledge. Within the gilded chambers, the royal physicians experimented in desperation. They ground pearls into powder and mixed them with crushed unicorn horn, the latter an apocryphal remedy rumoured to purge corruption. They compounded mercury pastes with secret herbs imported from the Indies, believing heavy metal might draw out the infection. In moments of final recklessness, they laid half-warm pigeons directly on the necrotic flesh, convinced that the bird's residual warmth would infuse the king's blood with life. Instead, Louis cried out in agony, his screams echoing like ghosts through the corridors, and the palace fell silent in shame. Nightmares joined the waking horror. Louis, once the epitome of regal composure, thrashed in his sleep, haunted by visions of battlefield corpses and plague-stricken victims. He cried out in a voiceless scream, sounding less like a monarch and more like a tormented child. The echoes of his anguish travelled along the grand galleries, rattling the armour displayed in the hall of battles and causing chambermaids and guards alike to shiver with dread. Many servants could not endure such nights. They resigned or fled in terror, leaving only the most devoted and the most desperate behind. Yet at dawn, no matter how ragged his slumber, Louis insisted on the lever. Curtains parted, revealing the king propped upon layers of cushions, his form still enough to appear almost statuesque. Courtiers entered as they always had, bowing with rigid courtesy, clutching perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses, standing at precise intervals so that the most polite of breezes would carry the stench away. They offered their morning reports, their voices barely above a whisper, then slipped away like ghosts through the ornate doors. State banquets followed, though they resembled funerary rites more than feasts. Louis was fed spoonful by spoonful of thin broth and strained oatmeal, each mouthful delivered by trembling hands. The gold goblet stood empty, save for water, as rich wines had grown sour to his taste. Around the long oak table, ministers sat stiffly, eating only to maintain appearances, suppressing retches as the odour crept toward them. Fine porcelain plates displayed untouched game and sugar sculptures, artful displays of abundance that mocked the king's dwindling appetite. Word of the horrors at Versailles spread beyond France's borders. In Venice, the Doge's ambassador penned a grave dispatch on July 23rd, 1711. The stench in the royal apartments surpasses any mortal's endurance. In Madrid, the Spanish envoy requested his recall on September 1st, 1712, citing urgent affairs of state, a polite fiction to justify escape from the court's decay. By then, Europe's leading powers understood that no crown of gold, no ceremony of silk and brocade, could conceal the undeniable rot that consumed the Sun King's body. Thus, the gilded court that had once symbolized absolute power and refinement became a testament to the fundamental truth. No earthly authority can suspend the cycles of life and death. Even as Louis XIV pressed on with his rituals, each ceremony chipped away at the myth he had spent 77 years constructing. The palace's mirrored halls reflected his glory still, but beneath the surface, in the spreading shadows of his flesh, lay the final, inescapable proof that all men, king and peasant alike, must yield to the silent sovereignty of mortality. In the final days of his life, Louis XIV found himself caught in a harrowing struggle between power and mortality. Once renowned for dancing until dawn in glittering court ballets, by the summer of 1715, even the simple act of sitting upright became an ordeal. Each morning's ritual the lever had transformed into a grotesque parody of its former splendor. Gentle women in waiting donned perfumed gloves and stood at a precise distance, afraid to inhale the putrid odor emanating from the king's failing body. Courtiers whispered that the ulcer on his left leg had grown so vast, nearly 6 inches across, that one might glimpse the gleaming white of bone within its depths. One by one, the royal physicians departed in horror. Initially, they had offered hope with their powdered remedies and cauterizing irons, but as the gangrene advanced, only a handful remained out of duty or desperation. They dared not speak openly. Instead, they huddled in hushed corners, trading furtive glances over hastily folded surgical instruments. Louis, ever the embodiment of absolutism, clung to his throne even as reason slipped away. He spent long hours listening to council reports, then would suddenly collapse in terror at rumors of conspiracies or imagined betrayals. In delirium, he called out the names of long-dead ministers, clutching his cushions as though they were the spectres of his past errors. Nutrition, once a symbol of opulence, was now unattainable. The fortified wines served at banquets soured in his mouth like vinegar. Rich game meats turned to desiccated leather on his tongue. The most elaborate pâtés and pastries lay untouched on golden platters, mocking his fading appetite. By late August, the king's frame had dwindled to such an extent that some courtiers believed a wax effigy had replaced the living monarch on the exalted throne. Each paroxysm of fever seemed to echo through the grand galleries. The liquid squelch of festering wounds, the rustle of shifting bandages, and the hollow, haunted gaze of a sovereign who once proclaimed himself the center of the universe. Despite the agony that racked him, Louis persisted in the rituals that defined his reign. On the morning of August 29th, he summoned his ministers for the final lever. The heralds announced his name in measured tones. The curtains parted to reveal the king propped on silk cushions, his gaunt cheeks sunken, and his crown nearly slipping from his scalp. He received his morning reports with a weary nod, then dismissed the assembly with a fragile gesture. A hush fell over the hall as the attendants retreated. Perfumed gloves folded neatly in their hands, their faces mask-like in their polite detachment. That same evening, Louis made his last attempt at showing strength. He insisted on dining an event marked more by ritual than sustenance. A single bowl of strained broth was presented upon a silver tray. Servants approached with trembling hands, feeding him spoonful after spoonful until he could eat no more. The courtiers remained seated at a respectful distance, their silence heavier than any proclamation of mourning. The chamber's flickering candlelight cast elongated shadows on the walls, transforming the ornate tapestries into ghostly billows of fabric. In the hours that followed, the king's fever peaked. He drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring fragments of sermons he had heard as a boy, and verses from hymns long ago sung in Notre Dame. His breathing grew laboured, each inhale accompanied by a rasping sound that filled the vast room with dread. Nurses moved quietly to adjust his pillows. A priest administered last rites, the silver cross glinting against the pale sheet. Outside, the night air was thick with the scent of incense burned to counteract the stench of decay, creating a surreal mixture of sanctity and rot. Then came the final moment. On September 1st, 1715, at precisely midnight, Louis XIV surrendered to the relentless advance of disease. His final breath escaped in a soft sigh, slipping past lips that had once commanded armies and shaped nations. In that instant, the grand spectacle of Versailles, its mirrored halls, its gilded furniture, its elaborate ceremonies fell silent. The courtiers who had spent lifetimes vying for his favour now wept openly, not for the loss of power, but for the stark reminder of their shared mortality. Thus ended the reign of the Sun King, not in triumphant glory, but in the quiet tragedy of a man laid low by forces beyond any crown's reach. His death served as the ultimate proof that no matter the magnitude of one's authority, all earthly grandeur must give way to the unyielding equality of death. Beneath the brightest rays of absolute power lay a simple truth. Every life, whether draped in velvet or humble wool, ultimately returns to the same silent darkness. In the dim prelude to each dawn, Louis XIV clung to the ritual of the lever with iron determination. Precisely at 6 o'clock each morning, servants arrayed outside his chamber door, perfumed handkerchiefs pressed to their noses, awaited the silent signal to enter. The faintest rustle of silk drapes marked the moment when the king, propped upon silken cushions, granted his audience. One by one, the bowed figures of courtiers passed before him, murmuring their obeisance and presenting their morning reports as though reciting prayers in a sacred ceremony. The corridors of Versailles, normally alive with the vibrant display of courtly life, became an arena of hushed devotion, the odours of incense and sandalwood enveloped in the undercurrent of decay from the blackened wound on the king's left leg. Following the lever, the great state banquet commenced without interruption to its traditional guest list. Ambassadors and ministers stood at precisely measured intervals around the long oak table, their fine attire sharply contrasting with the pale, frail figure of Louis reclining upon his throne-like chair. Despite the lavish spread, silver platters heaped with thin oatmeal broth, strained vegetable consommé, and delicate spoonfuls of almond milk. Each serving was delivered by a trembling hand. The king, his face skeletal and drawn, received spoonful after spoonful of the thin gruel, each mouthful a tragic echo of the sumptuous feasts he had once commanded. The clink of porcelain bowls and the low murmur of etiquette formed a woeful soundtrack to the spectacle, as a sovereign who had once embodied absolute power now gasped for each swallow. Between these morning rites, Louis endured excruciating episodes of delirium. Night after night, he tossed among silk sheets, calling out the names of imaginary enemies and lost comrades. He would shriek into the darkness voices without words, a raw, primal sound that reverberated along the walls of the private apartments. When the fit of madness subsided, he lay still, his lidless eyes fixed on the painted ceiling above, where cherubs and saints gazed down in stark irony upon his suffering. The necrotic wound, once a dull sore, had spread into a living tapestry of black and purple. Flesh hung in sinewy strands, the edges curled like malevolent vines encircling his thigh. Whispers circulated among the courtiers that, in the depths of the ulcer, one could glimpse the white sheen of bone itself. In their desperation, the royal physicians continued their experiments with the most outlandish remedies of the age. They pulverized pearls into fine powder and blended it with fragments of unicorn horn, a mythical substance fabled to draw out poison. They concocted mercury ointments, believing the heavy metal might purge the rot. In the most extreme measure, they pressed half a living pigeon, its down still warm, directly against the wound in a superstitious plea for the bird's vitality to infuse the king's blood. Each application prompted a howl of agony so searing that it resounded through the palace halls, sending the night watch scurrying to a distant chamber. On particularly brutal nights, the guards took turns drawing lots to determine who would empty the chamber pots, a task none relished, as the contents had become so rank that even seasoned servants recoiled. By candlelight, the space around the king was a macabre tableau of damp bandages and ragged linens, the soft rustle of fabric intermingled with his harsh, ragged breaths. Occasionally the medical bell would toll, summoning physicians for yet another attempt at treatment. Hypodermic needles and long probes were brandished, but every injection and incision only intensified his misery. As the infection ravaged his body, it seeped into his mind. Louis's grip on reality loosened, and he could no longer distinguish between the ghosts of Le Havre's harbour battles and the present agony. The courtiers, once eager to align themselves with his favour, now cowered in dim alcoves, avoiding his haunted gaze as though it were that of a condemned criminal rather than the Sun King. Thus, each day at Versailles unfolded as a grim spectacle. The morning lever, once a triumphant display of sovereign majesty, had become a ritual of endurance for both monarch and courtiers alike. The state banquet, designed to celebrate abundance, stood as a stark reminder of life's frailty. And in the fleeting hours between ceremony and nightmare, Louis XIV, master of elaborate pageantry, found himself powerless before the relentless advance of rot and delirium. Even within the hallowed halls of the greatest palace in Europe, the most carefully scripted performance could not conceal a king's inevitable decline into darkness. When the gangrene finally opened into what courtiers whispered was a death pit, nearly 15 centimetres across, Versailles began to resemble a living tomb. By the late spring of 1705, the ulcer on Louis XIV's leg had widened until its edges were rimmed in blackened flesh. Each night he lay restless atop silk sheets, saturated with his own foul exudate, the once luxurious bedding now a canvas for decay. Though he closed his eyes, every rustle of the drapes sounded to him like the rattling of bones. The faint chirp of night insects in the gardens drifted through the open windows like the suppressed moans of rotting flesh. Only the strongest sedatives, precisely compounded opiates and barbiturates administered by the royal physicians, could coax him into a slumber of uneasy dreams. Upon waking, Louis would startle upright, calling the names of ministers long departed. He spoke of betrayals from 60 years past, as if reliving slights from his own childhood seeking vengeance or forgiveness. He could not say which. His memory, once as sharp as the point of a rapier, had become tortured and fragmented, torn between the spectres of his past glories and the present agony of a body betraying him from within. Throughout the palace, courtiers and servants undertook an all-out campaign of incense and fumigation to stave off the stench of death. Bronze censers of sandalwood and frankincense were stoked day and night, their fragrant smoke filling every corridor and chamber. Yet the thicker the clouds of smoke, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. Staff learned to hold their breath for brief moments. While performing their duties, each curtsy was accompanied by a hasty exhalation through pressed lips. Even Madame de Maintenon, the king's devoted second wife, spent her days kneeling by his bedside, praying fervently amid swirling plumes of perfumed smoke. Yet the chapels of Versailles, once sanctuaries of divine authority, now reeked of a morbid fusion. Sacred incense layered atop the sour odour of mortal rot, as though death itself had claimed the hallowed halls. In the midst of this suffocating haze, nutrition became an afterthought. The vintages that once flowed in crystal goblets now soured on his tongue like spoiled vinegar. Game meats, once a testament to royal abundance, tasted like dried parchment. Even the clearest vegetable consommé provoked nausea. From the ulcer oozed a thick, black ichor that stained the dais rivulets of death-tracing patterns across the gleaming marble. As the king shrank away from sustenance, his frame grew skeletal, his skin drawn taut over his ribs, rendering him a hollow spectre. In delirium he rose at dawn, clutching at the fine damask draperies, mumbling penitential prayers for sins both real and imagined. Illicit liaisons, wars waged in his name, countless lives sacrificed for his glory. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagon, once confidant to the royal household and renowned for his cabinet of rare botanicals, now bowed his head in silent despair. He had stocked vials of pearl powder, tinctures of unicorn horn, as fanciful a remedy as ever besmirched a medical ledger, yet none could stem the relentless spread of infection. Proposals were made for radical measures: amputation of the afflicted limb, or even transfusion of peasant blood drawn in earnest supposition that the vigour of the common folk might revitalise the monarch. But Louis, too frail to endure surgery and too weakened to spare a drop of his fading lifeblood, refused. In the hush of his final hours, he reached out with trembling fingers to grasp the hands of his loyal chevaliers and ministers. His sunken eyes shone with unshed tears as he whispered, "Do not let me die alone." It was in that frail confession, when the master of courtly intrigue and absolutist spectacle revealed the nakedness of his terror, that the truth lay bare. No crown, no ritual, no pageantry could guard a man from the impartial decree of death. And so, as Versailles trembled with the echoes of his suffering and the dark incense mingled with the stench of putrefaction, Louis XIV stood stripped of artifice. In the heart of the greatest court in Europe, where power had once glittered like gold leaf, he learned at last that in the end, every sovereign and subject alike must submit to the silent, inescapable gravity of mortality. By the final days of August in the year 1715, the condition of Louis XIV had deteriorated beyond what any courtier could have imagined. The gangrenous wound on his left leg, once a small ulcer, had swollen to more than twice the size of its healthy counterpart. The skin stretched taut and glistening, resembling an overripe plum ready to burst. Each time the dressings were changed, the damp bandages released a choking, nauseating stench that overwhelmed the wax candles lining the walls of his chamber. The flames guttered and died, leaving only flickers of darkness. Flies gathered in swarms around the silken bed, forming a living crowd of buzzing scavengers beside the monarch's failing body. Even the palace cats, once pampered pets, fled in terror, hissing at the air around the littered sheets. In rare moments of lucidity, Louis would summon a mirror. He demanded to see his own reflection, longing perhaps to glimpse the face that once inspired awe. But when the glass was brought, he recoiled at the sight. The visage that had been likened to Apollo's marble features now resembled a skull wrapped in yellowed parchment. With a trembling voice, he ordered the mirror removed. "Take it away," he would murmur, and pressed his palms to his eyes in shame and horror. These fleeting cradles of vanity became tragic reminders of the dignity he had so meticulously constructed, now stripped away by the ruthless advance of decay. Night after night, nightmare and reality blurred into one. Louis cried out in anguished screams, calling the names of imagined enemies and the long-dead figures of his past. Sometimes he shouted for his mother, Marie-Thérèse, who had died when he was only 11 years old. His cries echoed through the thick stone walls, turning the palace corridors into tunnels of dread. Maidservants and guards moved with heady handkerchiefs clamped to their faces, afraid that even a whiff of the rotting flesh would overwhelm them. At times he raged and thrashed like a wild beast, claws of sinew and tendon trying to tear away the flesh that bound him to his mortal coil. The court itself teetered on the brink of collapse. While the machinery of government ground on council chambers still convened, edicts were still issued. The very act of governance became a burden under Versailles' stifling atmosphere. Foreign ambassadors scarcely dared linger. The Venetian envoy would arrive for his allotted audience, bow before the bed, mutter the required pleasantries, and then flee in haste, citing urgent matters in the Serenissima. The Spanish ambassador, after a mere 7 minutes in the royal presence, would claim a sudden illness and depart, his exit marked by grave-faced apologies. Slowly, word spread through European capitals. France's gilded facade masked a rot from within. At the heart of this disintegration lay the humiliating spectacle of power undone. Versailles, once the pinnacle of cultural and political brilliance, had become a curtain of illusion concealing a chasm of putrefaction. Beneath the gold leaf and polished marble, the rot of one man's body seeped into the very soul of the monarchy. Courtiers who had once vied for the smallest favour now fought merely to maintain their composure, to breathe without retching, and to continue the charade that Louis XIV remained the Sun King. Thus, as the month of August waned into its final week, the court found itself living in a half-world between reverence and revulsion. Every morning's lever, every state banquet, every council session was shadowed by the memory of that grotesque wound. The flames that once symbolized eternal glory now flickered in fear. The mirrored galleries reflected not triumph, but terror. And in the throne room, where Louis XIV had once sat resplendent in brocade and jewels, lay a man reduced to a frail shadow, his legacy dissolving into the same dust from which all human deeds are shaped. Each morning, Louis XIV awoke to a ritual that had become both ceremony and torment. The grand morning audience, once a teeming gathering filled with eager advisers and foreign emissaries, had degenerated into little more than a perfunctory exercise in obeisance. As the clock struck 6 o'clock, the corridors outside his bedchamber would fill with the muted shuffle of courtiers, civil and military officials alike, positioning themselves at a carefully enforced distance from the throne. Perfumed handkerchiefs pressed to their noses were their only defense against the overpowering stench of corruption that radiated from the ulcer on the king's thigh. Intent on preserving decorum, they stood stiffly, heads bowed, eyes half-lidded, furtively nodding off between the litany of reports delivered in hushed tones. Once they had proclaimed their respects and delivered their dossiers, they retreated like shadows, each exhalation a quiet expression of relief as the odour receded behind the closed doors. Despite his utter lack of appetite, the state banquet followed without interruption. The banquet hall remained fully staffed, silver platters glimmering under crystal chandeliers. Yet the plates were merely decorative. For Louis, each dish, whether a delicate consommé, a fine spoonful of oatmeal gruel, or a silver bowl of strained fruit puree, served only as a token of past opulence. He could no longer taste the richness of courtly cuisine. Each mouthful was an exercise in endurance rather than pleasure. The courtiers around him nibbled at their own offerings, glancing with forced civility at the gaunt figure on the dais, whose eyes were fixed on a single spoonful of broth that he lifted with trembling fingers. As the days advanced toward the 1st of September, the gangrene crept upward, claiming new territory on the king's body. The rot spread from his left leg to his hip and abdomen, blossoming into clusters of secondary abscesses that erupted like black flowers across his skin. Each pustule emitted a wet, gurgling sound, reminiscent of a funeral horn echoing through the silent halls. When the dressings were removed, the bandages themselves hissed and crackled as they tore away from the festering flesh, leaving behind ragged strips of soaked linen that clung to polished marble and damask upholstery alike. Even the sumptuous tapestries and fine quilts were saturated with the king's exudate, revealing in every stain the inexorable collapse of his once glorious frame. Gradually, the palace staff dwindled. Many servants, unable to endure the perpetual miasma, resigned or escaped to quieter corners of the kingdom. Those who remained did so out of a rigid sense of duty, faces concealed behind cotton masks or embroidered scarves. They moved like reluctant spectres through the corridors, performing their tasks with mechanical precision. Each curtsy, each whispered greeting, was accompanied by a silent prayer to withstand the sight and scent of the king's decay. At night, they could hear him shrieking for aid, uttering pitiful pleas for forgiveness, his voice trembling as he recounted sins both real and imagined. The juxtaposition of Versailles' opulent fabrics and the pervasive aura of death created a disorienting atmosphere in effect, a simultaneous celebration and requiem. Outside the gilded walls of Versailles, word of the monarchy's deterioration spread like wildfire. Rumours of the king's rotting body and the suffocating stench that overwhelmed even the grandest spaces became common parlance in every court across Europe. In Parisian salons, the once admiring chatter turned to grim mockery. "Each wish for long life feels like a curse," wrote one insider, "for no mortal ritual can postpone the end." Nobles and foreign dignitaries began to question the viability of absolute rule. If the monarch himself could be undone by such base forces, decay and disease, then what hope remained for a system that demanded unwavering fealty? The legend of the Sun King's invincibility, built over 77 years of ceremonious display, now lay shattered upon the marble floors of his own palace. Thus, as the last days of August waned toward the 1st of September, Versailles stood as a stark testament to the vanity of human endeavour. The lever, the banquet, the council sessions, all continued in form but had lost their substance. The courtiers, trained for deference and spectacle, found themselves navigating a realm where the trappings of power could not disguise the fundamental truth, that even the mightiest sovereign must succumb to the same final act as any common man. And so, beneath the gilded ceiling and behind the velvet drapes, the rotting legacy of Louis XIV unfolded in quiet horror, an inescapable reminder that no throne is immune to the silent decree of mortality. By the waning days of August in the year 1715, the court of Versailles teetered on the edge of collective madness. Among the few who dared record the horrors was the Duc de Saint-Simon, the sharp-eyed chronicler of court life. In his private journal, he noted a terror spreading through these gilded halls not born of pity, but of sheer psychological shock at seeing the living corpse of our sovereign decaying before our very eyes. The courtiers, who once jostled for the king's favour, now wept not for loss of prestige, but because the sight of their monarch's rotting flesh transcended every limit of human endurance. Yet Louis XIV stubbornly maintained his final rights of sovereignty, as though the grand machinery of absolutism might somehow ward off death itself. Each morning, he demanded the usual reports. Ministers presented their dossiers in halting tones, only to see his glassy gaze drift past them. His attention, once razor-sharp, now flickered like a dying candle. The lever ceremony, that apex of courtly homage, had become a tedious charade. Courtiers even drew lots to determine who would be brave or perhaps foolish enough to approach his bedside without collapsing. Those granted the dubious honour of standing nearest numbered themselves among the lucky few to witness the last vestiges of royal authority. Desperate for any cure, the royal physicians, led by Dr. Guy Crescent-Fagan and joined by specialists summoned from across Europe, turned to the most exotic remedies known. They packed the gangrenous cavity with powders of emerald and crushed mummy, substances rumoured in alchemical lore to draw out corruption. They applied pastes of powdered pearl and unicorn horn, believing these precious materials might extract the rot like a magnet. Instead, each new application elicited fresh screams of agony that echoed through the marble corridors. The esteemed physician from Vienna, after merely glancing at the grotesque wound, petitioned for leave on urgent affairs of state and hastened back home. A visiting surgeon from London, upon examining the lesion, fainted to the floor in a spasm of revulsion, his body convulsing until he vomited upon the king's own velvet carpet. As the medical fraternity collapsed into futility, Louis descended deeper into despair. Convinced that his affliction was divine retribution, he turned to religion with frantic zeal. He summoned a procession of priests day and night, confessing every sin he could recall. Illicit liaisons in the hidden boudoirs of Versailles, merciless campaigns across European fields, the cruel edicts that had driven dissenters to the stake. His voice, hoarse from fever, pleaded for absolution, his emaciated hands clasped in desperate prayer. His skin, once bronzed by the sun of his youth, had grown pallid and yellowed, as though exhumed from an ancient tomb. Beside him, Madame de Maintenon knelt in relentless vigil, her whispered supplications lost in the swirl of incense smoke and fetid air. Yet even faith seemed powerless amid the cacophony of scents, frankincense, sandalwood, and the underlying stench of putrefaction melding into a sickening fugue. In those final, tormented hours, The chapel-like corridors of Versailles felt more like a desecrated sanctum than a place of worship. The holy trappings, altar-like dining tables, gilded reliquaries of courtly ritual stood submerged in a haze of death. "It is as if the very sanctity of this palace has been defiled," one courtier whispered, "where the incense of prayer has been overtaken by the smoke of decay." From beneath the ornate doors came the ceaseless murmurs of a kingdom in collapse. The rattling of chamber pots, the distant sobs of attendants, the feeble crackle of a priest's Latin litany, attempting to rebuke the corporeal horror. And so, behind the opulent facade, behind the tapestries depicting victories and divine favour, lay the ultimate vindication of mortality's impartial decree. The Sun King, who once declared himself the centre of the world, lay stripped of artifice in a bedchamber that had become his sepulchre. Around him, the grandeur of Versailles served only to magnify the abyss beneath. A testament that no matter the richness of robes or the splendour of ceremony, every human life, crowned or common, must bow to the same inexorable fate. Under the golden crown, a shuddering voice observed as they fled the corridors, lies naught but a mortal skull. Oh. And so, as the final echoes of courtly ritual and the last faint flickers of candlelight fade into the soft embrace of memory, we allow ourselves to lean back from the grandeur and the horror alike, taking a gentle breath as the walls of Versailles dissolve into a quiet hush. No longer must we dwell on the gilded halls, or the tormented cries of a dying king, for in the stillness that follows we find a measure of peace. The shadows that once clung so insistently to every tapestry and mirror become mere whispers of a tale now told, drifting away like autumn leaves on a slow, meandering stream. In this moment of calm reflection, we remember what Louis XIV's tragic final days revealed to us, that beneath even the most resplendent crown, we are all bound by the same fragile thread of mortality, and that the greatest power any of us can wield is the grace with which we accept our common fate. It is in acknowledging our vulnerability, our shared human frailty, that we discover a deeper compassion for one another, a gentle kindness that transcends rank, wealth, or station. In the hush of night, we recognize that every life, no matter how exalted, ultimately seeks the same solace, the simple comfort of rest, and the quiet hope of being remembered with warmth rather than fear. So let the final image of decay soften into a memory, and let your mind drift across open fields of lavender dusk, where soft breezes carry the scent of new beginnings. Imagine yourself lying beneath a vast starlit sky, the weight of the day slipping from your shoulders as each breath brings a wave of calm. Feel the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of your chest, a reminder that even as kingdoms rise and fall, your own heart continues its steadfast pulse, guiding you gently into dreams. As you settle into the comfort of your blankets and allow the world to soften at the edges, let this story's message linger like a lullaby, that humility and empathy are the true markers of a life well lived, and that in sharing both our triumphs and our vulnerabilities, we weave the kind of connection that outlasts any empire. May you carry this calm understanding into your own slumber, and awaken with a lighter spirit, ready to greet the day with compassion and grace. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history's quietest tragedy. If you've found peace in these whispered recollections, please subscribe to our channel for more gently told tales and the very best new videos we have to offer. Sleep well, and may your dreams be soft and serene.